Hello guys. So welcome back to the Learning Python from Scratch series. So this is day 2, and today we're just going to be going into something new. So if you're here for the first time, so basically this is a Python series where I'll be learning Python day to day for 30 days, and then in the process, as you guys follow my journey, and as you guys watch me learn in the process, you can also learn as well, right? So today we're just going to be going into something different. Last week we just did a basic introduction into Python, what Python is and why it is a choice for developers today, and its uses as well. So today we're also going to be focusing on writing our first Python code. So first of all, as you can see, I'm in an environment, right? And you may be wondering, what is this? So this is Jupyter Notebook, right? So Jupyter Notebook is basically an open source web application where you can easily write codes, you can write equations, you can share documents, and then you can also send it as emails, you can save it as PDFs. This is just basically where you write a lot of code that has to do with data science. And if you listen to the name very carefully, it's Jupyter. So it's a combination of mainly primarily three data science languages, which are Julia, Python, and R. So these are languages that are very used that are used a lot for data science and data analysis as well. So as a machine learning engineer and also data scientist, you're gonna need to have a knowledge about how to use Jupyter Notebook in your tech stack, right? So let's just go into this right now. As you can see, the environment is very organized. So now we're going to be, writing our first Python code. Hooray! All right. So as you all know, the basic step for every developer when you learn a new language is always the hello world, right? So it's kind of like a tradition at this point. So let's write our first hello world. So as you can see, it's already written here. But this is the basic syntax for Python. As you can see, like we discussed in the previous video, it's very intuitive and very understand. It's very similar to the English language. So you just write print hello Python, and then it prints this output for you, right? Once you execute the cell. And if you want to execute a cell in Jupyter, always make sure that maybe you come over here and then you click on run, or you can use the shortcut key on your keyboard, which is shift and enter. Shift and enter will run the code, and then you will see this output, right? So this is congratulations. This is the first Python code that you have written so far. All right, so now let's progress. Um, yeah, so if you also want to know what version of Python we are using, right? So Python basically there are basically two versions of Python. The most popular ones, which are Python 2 and Python 3. So these are the most popular versions, but right now the most widely used and most acceptable is Python 3. So what we're going to be using primarily is Python 3. So if you want to check the version that you have on your PC, you can run I'm just going to write it in this cell, but this is not an actual code, right? So you want to write this in your terminal. So if you run this code in your command line, you should be able to know the version of Python that you're using, right? It's going to show you the version of Python that you're using on your computer, right? Or if you want to know what version you're using, you can also run this in your um you can also execute this code in a Python file, and then it shows you exactly what version you're using. So as you can see, this is the version of Python that is installed in this environment, in this web application that we're using right now. All right, so now we're going to be doing some practice on writing comments, right? So when you want to write a comment in Python, we usually use the hashtags. So you use this particular symbol before your comments. You can write inline comments, or you can write comments at the head of your code, right? So you can use this for documentation, documenting your codes and all that stuff. It just provides more context into what you're writing or what you're doing. So as you can see here, this is an inline code where you say, okay, this is what print hello world is going to do. So you're basically telling the person that's reading your code that this line will print a string, and you can see this is a string. Hello Python is a string. Um it's wrapped around this quotation marks. You can either use the single quotation or you can use the double quotes. Both of them will work, but make sure that you don't use maybe you don't use a single quote and then a double quote. This will print out an error. Make sure that you're using the same type of code. So this would work as well as single quotes would also work, right? So this is basically how to write comments in Python. We're also going to be talking about like multiple line comments, but that one will be later during the series. We'll be breaking all that down. And also make sure that there are a lot of errors that you can encounter in, when you write your code in Python. This is all part of the developer's process. You will always encounter errors, but um, yeah, so you're gonna get an error message if you make any mistake. Maybe if you make a typographical error, that will give you a syntax error. So anything that you're writing, make sure that you're writing the right thing. So for example, here now, if you execute this particular cell, you're gonna get an error because print is not recognized by Python. It's not defined. So you have to make sure that you're spelling everything correctly. As you can see, the correct one is supposed to be print. So let's say you correct this, right? And now you execute. So you can see your code has successfully run, printing out a string, hello Python, right? So you have to also, so anytime you have an error message, just try to read through the error message, understand what it is. It's going to give you the type of error. So it has like a name error to show you, is it a syntax error? Once you have a syntax error, you know that you made a mistake in writing in the way that you wrote the code, right? Maybe you made a typographical error, or yeah. So that's what a syntax error basically is. You see that here's another syntax error, right? So in this syntax error, you did not terminate your string, right? So basically you opened it up with a quotation, right? And you did not close it. So you have to close it in order for you for in order for this line to successfully run. So let's try that again. So you can see your code has printed correctly. Good. So now you have to also understand that Python basically is an interpreted language. So it does not necessarily compile your code all together and then give you an error at the end of maybe your runtime when you're running the code, right? Because there are a lot of languages that are called compiled languages, right? Compiled languages, it's after you've written your entire program and then maybe you want to compile the entire code, and then it's going to tell you that, okay, this is the error, and so line, like that. No, no, no. But in terms of Python, as you're writing each line of code, it gives you line by line, um it interprets your code just line by line. So if it encounters an error maybe at a particular line, the rest of those lines will not print, right? Whereas some other languages, they just let it be like that, and then maybe when you're compiling your code, it will give you the errors maybe on your console or something like that. But in this case, in Python, every line is executed. So if you encounter an error in any line, the remaining code will not work. So let's see this for example now. So you see, the first line of code was printed, right? But then the second line had an error. And because of this error, as you can see, this syntax error here, the remaining line of code did not print, right? So as you can see, the error that was generated here is called a name error. We have syntax error, we have name error. So this is basically a typo. So it's telling you that there is something wrong in your code. right? So now, if you want to run your first program, right? You know that print. This is basically the print function. So you're writing a string inside of the print function. You're calling this string inside of the print function. Hello world, right? So this is what you want to print. So the print function basically prints your code. It basically prints yeah, it prints your code on the console. So let's say maybe you execute this now. This is what you have printed. So this is as a result of the print function. Great. So now you can also use comments in your code as well. So if you want to like explain what your code is doing more, always make sure that you include comments. Comments are very important because it makes your code very understandable and very readable as well. All right, so now let's move on to the next section and let's talk about data types in Python. So as we all know, like types are a very fundamental part of programming languages, right? So in Python, there are many data types. There are many types, and you can actually look at them on the official documentation of Python. But for beginners, we're only going to be dealing with a few of them. So we have the integer, we have the floats, we have the string as well, and we also have the booleans, right? So these ones are the most common types. We have the string, integers, and floats. So let's say whenever like maybe you have like a sentence or maybe like a word that's wrapped up in a quotation, right? Maybe you have a sentence or you have text. That's basically a string, right? And then when you have numbers, on the other hand, we're dealing with the integer data type, right? When you have like numbers, real numbers, maybe you have positive and negative integers as well, including zero. That's when we're dealing with the int. And now floats have more to do with decimal points. So when we're dealing with decimals, then we're talking about floats. Maybe we're trying to look what's in between 1 and 2. Like you know that there are a lot of decimal points in between 1 and 2. So that's where floats come in, right? All right. So these are basically the data types that we just spoke about. And when you're writing these types, we already have the type function right here. So if you want to know like the type of expression that you're dealing with, you can use this type function to tell you exactly what the data type of that expression is, right? So now in Python, the data types, they are always abbreviated. They are abbreviated as integer has is called int, floats is called float, and then strings is also abbreviated as str, which is string, short form for string, right? So now we want to know like the type of 12. Before that, can you just guess what type this is? Okay. You guessed correctly. Of course, it's int because it has to do with a positive integer that has no decimal places, right? So this is an int data type. But now we are dealing with a data type, an integer basically that has decimal points, right? So you can see it's a floating point number. And then now we have a string of text, right? So this is basically a string of sentences or text. What do you think is going to print? Of course, it's a string, right? Perfect. So now let's do an example. Now let's test the type of 12.0. Can you already guess what it is? I'm sure you already know. Of course, it's a float. So as you can see, it's a float. Right. So yeah. So basically, these are all examples of floating point numbers. So there are some limitations in floats. Maybe there are some limitations to like the extent to which the decimals can be represented sometimes in your runtime environment. So it's always important to check. So let's just run these cells first. As you can see, these are all floats. Yeah, so these are all floats. So now if you want to check the limit to like to the floating point, you can import system and then you use this method to check it. right? As you can see, this is the max, and this is also the minimum. So this is basically telling you that there is a limit to how there's a limit to the representation of the floating point. So this will tell you what's the largest and the smallest number that can be represented with them, right? Yeah. All right, guys. So now let's just dive into something else as now. So now you can actually convert one type to a different type. So you can check the type. You check the type, this should tell you that this is an int. And then maybe if you want to convert an integer to a float, right? We already know that 2 is an integer, right? 2 is an integer. But now if you want to convert it into a float, you just write the data type in front and then you pass it the into the expression that you want to convert, right? So now we know that 2 is an int. We've already checked the data type above and we know that 2 is an int, but now we've converted it into a float. So if you print this, if you execute this, it should tell you that it's now a float, right? So now it's going to convert it into a float, which is now 2.0 rather than 2, which is int, right? So now you want to check like the type. You want to check like the type of the data type now of 2 that we've already converted, right? So now you execute this. What do you have? You have a float. Although if you look at 2 like this, you already know intuitively that 2 is an int, but now you've been able to convert it into a float, right? So now you have to be very careful, right? You can easily convert an integer into a float and there will be no problem, right? But then if you're converting a float into an integer, let's say maybe you want to convert 1.1 or 1.2, 1.3 into from a float to an integer, you know that you have decimal places involved. And when you're dealing with very sensitive data, you can actually lose a lot of data. So it's not advisable to frequently convert floats into integers because you might end up losing a lot of data because even those decimal points and numbers after the decimal point are very significant in some data analysis. So as data scientists, we have to be very meticulous and careful with how we use and analyze data. All right, so now if you want to convert a number to a string, we already know that this is an integer, right? The type of this is an integer, but then you can also convert it into a string. So now you have it in quotation because remember, strings are always wrapped in quotation. You must start a string with a quotation and end it in a quotation. That denotes it as a string, right? So now you want to convert this float to a string as well. What do you think is going to happen? You're also going to see the quotations, right? So now you've been able to convert one some this this shows you that you can easily convert between data types in Python, right? So now when we're dealing with the Boolean data type, the Boolean data types is usually has can take two values which are either true or false, 0 and 1, 1 and 0, I mean, respectively. So yeah, so this is the first data value for a Boolean, which is the true, and this is the false. Take note that these are very case sensitive. So true is not the same thing as true. These two things are not the same, right? So make sure that you start each value of a boolean with a capital letter, right? So now let's print this to see the type. You see this is a bool, but let's say you change it to true. Now let's see what we're gonna get. We're gonna get an error. We're gonna get a name error because true and true are not the same. So please take note of that. So now you can also convert an integer into a boolean, right? So what you have here is a boolean, right? So you have a boolean value here which is true, and now you want to convert it into an integer. So usually this takes the value of 1 and 0. So let's run this now. You see this is 1 and If you want to convert maybe a boolean now, if you want to convert, I mean, an integer to a boolean, you use the data type in front of the value that you want to convert, right? And then it gives you true, right? So this lets you know that 0 stands for false and 1 stands for true, right? It's the same thing as float as well. So the floating point, if you want to convert this boolean value now to a float, you know that it's gonna be an integer but represented in decimal form. So it's basically gonna be 1.0. All right. So now maybe if you want to check like the results of the data type of this, you just this will tell you the type basically. So it's telling you that this is a float, right? Because if you divide 6 divided by 2 will give you 3. So it's basically 3.0. So any arithmetic operation that you perform will give you a floating point number, right? But now if you want it to be expressed in integers where remember, just take note of this, that this is only one slash. But once you're using a double slash, you're letting them know that okay, I want this to be represented as an integer, right? You don't want the decimal places, you don't want the decimal points. The float usually does that because sometimes you may not be dividing. You may divide the number and then you may get the remainder, right? But now if you want to use the double slash, you're specifying that you only want it as an integer value, right? So this will print an integer for you. So take note of that. One slash will give you a float and a double slash will give you an integer. All right. So now what do you think the type of hello world is gonna be? Can you already guess? Of course, it's gonna be a string, right? So that's how you know. So what do you think the result of hello world is? This what is it gonna be? Of course, it's gonna give you a boolean because um hello and world are not the same thing, right? Are they the same thing? No, they're not the same thing. So it's not gonna it's gonna give you a bool, right? It's gonna now they say write the code to convert the following number representing employee ID to an integer. So basically this is how you do it. So now you want to convert this to a float. So basically you're converting a string into a float, right? 1, 2, 3, 4.56. Don't forget the quotation marks or you might get an error. So now this is now a floating point number. You've converted a string to a float. Now you want to convert this phone number to a string, right? So as you can see, it's written as an integer. So you want to convert it into a string. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. So now you've converted it to a string basically. All right, thank you so much, guys. So we've completed day 2, and what we've basically spoken about is we just introduced this web application Jupyter. We also just spoke about a bit about data types in Python, and this is just basically the foundation and the basic ones. I believe that as we go deeper and as we learn together, we're going to discover more complex data types and how we can actually really apply them in our work as data scientists. So thank you guys so much for sticking to the end, and I can't wait to see you guys on day 3. God bless.